Okay, here we go. All right. Hey, guys. Alex, how's it going?
It's going. It's a gloomy day in Atlanta. I feel like I'm back in Seattle, but I'll survive.
Good. Jeremy, how are you?
Hey, doing well.
Good, good. I am excited to be back. I was away on holiday. Got this very cool t-shirt that me and my friends bought, similar matching ones. So repping my holiday vibes from Valencia. Very nice start to my week. Awesome. Okay, let's kick into gear. So welcome everyone to the Keys to AWS Optimization, the show where we share stories, concepts, and solutions to help you unlock your spend at AWS. My name is Stephanie Gooch, and I am a senior commercial architect in the optics team. Alex?
And my name is Alex Head, and I run the optics team, which is everything cost optimization for our strategic customers at AWS.
Excellent. And today we've got Jeremy, and we're going to be talking all about tech diligence. We're going to look at a couple of ways in which he's experienced how to optimize and low-hanging fruit, well-architected labs, a whole smorgasbord of things to start with. And to kick us off, I wanted to just mention two things to start with. Number one, I just made, just before the session, a link tree. So this is a new thing, which, because we constantly share out links about things that me and Alex have maybe been on, like podcasts, like reInvent, like calendar invites. So it's all there. So feel free to check that out anytime. And if you are watching us on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe. Okay, Jeremy, enough chit chat. Do you want to give us a bit of background, a bit of your origin story?
Sure, yeah. Thanks again for having me on the show. My name is Jeremy Jackson. I'm the group CTO at ASG. ASG is a portfolio of 50 SaaS companies. So I get the pleasure and the pain of getting to see 50 different cloud workloads get optimized over time. I've been in the seat now for 4 years. My background is a developer by trade. Kind of came up first half of my career as a government consultant, kind of architect, building big government websites like Medicare.gov, CMS.gov, and then got pulled into Obamacare to fix healthcare.gov once upon a time. So big scale, big architecture, and then moved into kind of team management, scaling teams as small as 5, as large as 500, and now a portfolio as big as 50 companies and 1,500 resources globally. So I kind of say my career arc has been going from being a tech builder to a people builder to now a career builder over time, and it's been a wild ride. So.
Nice, thanks. And so today you're going to be telling us a bit about, we're going to focus on like 3 main areas. So we said we're going to talk about governance, we're going to talk about education of developers, which is always a hot topic on this show and generally in the FinOps world. When we had Rick on last week talking about right sizing, we also kind of touched on that. So if you are interested in that kind of conversation, check back to that episode. And then we're going to look at some low-hanging fruit on how to optimize. And I think generally me and Alex are just going to pick Jeremy's brains and ask any kind of questions. So, and of course, we want to hear from you. So any comments, questions in the chat, feel free to throw them in there and we can do our best. So to kick us off, Jeremy, when we were chatting, you were telling me that you use the Well Architected framework to start off reviews with companies. We've never had anybody talk about the Well Architected reviews and stuff. We talk about the labs all the time. But yeah, do you want to kind of set the scene and tell us why you used it and what you used it for?
Yeah, well, it tracks back to diligence, as you said. Oftentimes, I'm looking at these companies from an acquisition standpoint, from an investor lens. And what I kept falling back on is, while I have a lot of experience that I can draw from, my view is always going to be subjective, right? I'm always looking at it from my subjective lens. So how do I have kind of a quantitative instead of qualitative view on our portfolio? And I looked around the market, and there wasn't a lot of great frameworks out there that actually quantified tech debt, quantified industry best practices. And then a few years ago, stumbled on the Well Architected framework. So it was a unique position with their 5 pillars of excellence where I could just succinctly drill down what a good workload, what a good product looks like into these 5 pillars, measure it through their Well Architected framework, review and score set, and then get a numerical value, the output of that score. What that allowed me to do is actually baseline our portfolio. So now when a company comes in, we run it through the Well Architected framework, see where they stand compared to industry benchmarks. And then over time, we can remeasure it every year and show that we're making quantitative improvement, both qualitative and quantitative over time. So it's a really interesting tool. I think since then, it's some of it is morphed into the cost optimization tool that you get kind of in the dashboard. But we still like to use both because they're they're great again because you arm your engineering leads with a tactic and metric, something that's comparable to the industry, and allow them to tell their story of improvement.
So I'm going to jump in there because, Optics was made from a lot of that, right? Testing things out. Like, does this work? Do people respond to it customer wise? And benchmarking and setting those goals is a huge part of what we do and what's driven a lot of our success and building tools around that. And so, from your standpoint, it sounds like you kind of did your research, you looked around, and you landed on Well Architected. What are pieces outside of Well Architected that you use, or questions that you use to gather information or to kind of set that baseline, right? Maybe it's unique to that customer's industry or to their background or something like that.
In terms of tech diligence or quality of engineering? Yeah.
So obviously you run through Well Architected, but I'm sure you've been doing this for a bit now. So, what has evolved in that process? I'm sure, you set that precedence, but there's things that you personally probably add and take in as you're doing that.
Yeah. So it's interesting with companies, first from an investor acquisition lens, they look at things in terms of the P&L. So the profit and loss statement. And so one of the first things we do is just look at hosting. How much is it actually annually compared to their revenue? And so the industry benchmark of good for SaaS companies is between 3 and 7% of hosting as a percent of revenue. So that's kind of like the barometer. If they're outside of that range, that's telling me okay, they either have a very low cost, so maybe they're immature in terms of their cloud utilization, or high cost, so maybe they're way out of bounds. So there's something about this business that's irregular, maybe huge storage costs or huge compute costs because they're just doing a lot of kind of flex demand. So that's first thing, which is using some basic financial metrics to get a quadrant of where are they on that maturity curve, and are they kind of right in the sweet spot of growth, or are they kind of on the early phase or on the late phase? And we do that in R&D too. R&D as a percentage of metric is usually 15 to 25% of R&D as a percentage of revenue. But that helps me triangulate. From there, I tend to drill down on all the pillars of architecture, infrastructure, security, SDLC, team. But when it comes to the infrastructure, the Well Architected framework is our best quantitative metric that we can go get a rubric for success on. And again, because there are 5 kind of optimization pillars are really some of the 5 things you need to do, operational excellence, security, reliability, performance, and cost. Those are the things we like to drill down on, because in a world where as a technologist you could work on 1,000 things, the trick is to simplify to just a couple. And so we found over time, using the financials to triangulate, focusing on the pillars of technology, and then focusing on those well-architected pillars as a subset, have really helped us isolate and drill down into the most important things we can diligence.
Got it. So kind of finding those initial outliers, where is it off what we've seen, and starting there as a drill down. And I think, and Steph, you might have been on this customer call. We recently had a customer, and we noticed that, their compute seemed a little bit more irregular than normal. And they said, well, that's not something that we can really mess with our customer flow. But it was a starting point, right?
Right.
It's a starting talking point, and things that you can, I know we've said this on the show before, but just a quick check in Cost Explorer, look for those outliers, look for the things that are popping up. And maybe right off the bat, oh, that team's not going to change it, but use it as a talking point to understand why. And then you probably will find 10 other things to influence when you're doing that.
Totally.
Yeah, definitely. And don't forget, there's loads of tools out there, things like anomaly detection and stuff like that. So if there is stuff that starts to spike and you weren't prepared for it, you can have those things enabled just to help you keep an extra pair of eyes on your accounts. And definitely Alex's point of going and discussing this with your developers and saying, kind of ask that question why, so that you learn, and also so that you can understand from their point of view, so you don't keep asking them to do the same thing over and over again, and then being like, no, we can't, and then giving a reason. We had a customer the other day who I was talking to you about CloudWatch, and we found that they had super high EKS CloudWatch ingestion charges. So the log group was EKS, and they were like, oh, we didn't, first of all, they didn't know that's how they kind of identified what the charges were coming from. So we used some CloudWatch, we used some Kerr queries, and then they went and spoke to their developers, and they were like, oh, we didn't know it was costing us money. We'll just turn that off. We're not really using it. And so we asked that question, why? Not to challenge people, but just for that. So kind of moving on to what we also wanted to mention was, you said this interesting phrase of having like incentives to build around cost, using the cost pillar. Do you want to chat a bit more about that?
Yeah, so that's kind of the final pillar of cost optimization. And when I simplify what, the Well Architected framework does, it's really like 5 things. It's helping you get code out, helping you not get hacked, helping you stay up, helping you improve customer NPS, and then finally helping keep costs down. And that last part is so very important, because as engineering teams, you're often seen as cost centers for a business, right? So how do you help meet in the middle in terms of your executive stakeholders? How do you have some found money to bring to the table when you have initiatives that you want to bring forward? And for us, that's where the cost optimization can be so very critical, because it kind of arms you as an engineering leader to come to the board, to come to the executive stakeholder and say, hey, I really want to push forward, say, our CI/CD process. It's going to cost X, Y, and Z. It's going to take this many months. Here's our ROI at the end of the day. But to sweeten the deal, here's $100,000 I found in terms of our savings annually that we could start to garner to help incentivize this work. And for us, that's a big thing, obviously, as a PE shop, as an investing firm. EBITDA margins, financials are very important. So I've learned to speak financials, but for me, it's arming our technology teams with the tools they can use to help kind of, again, meet in the middle and drive those conversations. And so for us, cost optimization becomes our carrot, where so often you have to use a stick. And so this is kind of the halfway point.
Well, I would guess too, you started off talking about some of the correlation between the percentages of, what it's costing them versus their revenue.
Right.
And being on engineering teams in the past, I know, and working with a lot in our customers, usually the engineering teams don't even know what they're doing is correlated. And like, shameless plug for my KPI talk at reInvent, join us there. But bringing in that knowledge, is that something that you have done with customers in the past of, hey, this is the impact, right? Like this is what you're doing tied to the revenue and how we can make it even more efficient?
Yeah, 100%. So we have pretty robust financial dashboards that we've built from our finance systems intact into Tableau, and you can put any BI tool you want on it. But what's helpful about that is, as you all know, financial metrics are often lagging metrics, right? Your revenue, your EBITDA margin, things that come downstream of the work you're going to do in engineering. So how do you tie your leading metrics, some of the KPIs you're going to get out of probably your talk and your infrastructure in general? How do you tie those leading metrics to the lagging metrics? And that requires having observation of both and having observability of both. And so that's often what we try and do, is have a really tight understanding of our cost basis by baselining it and cost optimization tool and having some forecasting. And then how do we track that to the lagging metrics, which is like, hey, actually, when we ramp CI/CD, revenue started to improve, or this product output and velocity and usage started to improve. And that dotted line story is so very important to tell, because these tech enablers are like the first in a set of dominoes to move a business. And they're often forgotten that like that first domino has to fall before the rest of it can change.
So give us some examples. Steph, jump in. Sorry, I'm just like very intrigued.
No, go for it. Go for it.
Can you give us examples of some of the goals that you would set with these customers? It's to improve the well-architected framework. Definitely, a great way to quantify what you're doing, but you have to obviously have goals around that of where those are. And then I'm guessing some cost savings tie into that. So how do you establish those goals?
Yeah, it's a good question. They change a lot, but I'd say on the whole, what I often see for, let's call them SMBs, small to mid-sized businesses in the 50 to 75K monthly annual or AWS spend range, Those businesses typically fall under what I would categorize as the 50% of industry best practices. So sub 50 of all of the questions that Well Architected Framework asks, they'll get only 50 of those that they're actually doing. So our objective, or what we've seen over time, at least across an N of 50 companies now, is drive from 50%, sub 50% of industry best practices to above 70%. So our benchmark, what we call MBT, the minimum viable technology standard, is to drive above 70% of industry best practices. We found when you do that, you drive to 70% of industry best practices, you're stable, you're performant, you're largely not going to churn many customers, and you're going to have enough of a good baseline in your technology to keep the business growing. Now, are you going to have all of the bells and whistles, everything cost optimized, everything done? No, but at 70%, we found you're at a good run rate of spend in utilization and best practices that are going to allow you to be a stable, growing company. So that's kind of what we benchmark with Well Architected Framework. And then in terms of cost optimization, oftentimes companies coming into our portfolio haven't even really dug in at that. They haven't done any of all work. Maybe there's a savings plan, maybe there's ROI, but they haven't really done true savings utilization cost analysis. And so what we do is actually try and get to a 50% coverage spread across our portfolio, at least 50% of savings plans, savings utilization rates on at least their compute, and focus on that at first when we know we have some steady state spend on existing workloads that are not going to change a lot. And so for us, we found those two metrics as low watermarks of like hurdle rates, if you will, are some of the easiest metrics we can put in place, give to the engineering lead as guidance, and allow them to like knock out of the park. Most of them we found actually end up going from 50 to 90% in terms of Well Architected Framework, go from like 0% to 60, 70% in terms of savings utilization rate. So that's what you want. You don't want to set the bar too high. You do want to set a bar, but you want to make it an achievable bar that they can well clear and tell a success story around.
Awesome. Yeah, I like the setting the best practices and making them kind of achievable. I think that is something that people struggle with a lot, especially when it comes to KPIs or tracking. They just jump in at the deep end and then they're just like, we have to make this commitment, and they just freak out about it. I'm a massive advocate of, especially things like commitments. I started with $1 when it came to savings plans. I remember buying it. I feel like it makes you sound old in the cloud world that remember pre-savings plans now. But
yeah, right.
Graduate over time. So I want to transition a little bit over to education with these developers that you're working with at customers, and how you use these benchmarks and these goals with them to kind of drive education. Is there anything that you try and do specifically? Any recommendations you give to people if they are trying to educate their customers or their developers on best practices around kind of optimization?
Yeah, well, that's a bit tricky in that it's a big portfolio and a lot of different workloads. But for us, we have the benefit of working with AWS pretty closely. We have some great AWS SAs and a lot of AWS partner programs that we were part of. So we actually do a once-a-year FinOps day with both our financial leads and our Eng leads, usually the DevOps lead of our companies. And so we bring those folks together just to actually get them talking, which is like, you're looking at the financials, so you're seeing these lagging metrics and can call out when things have drastically changed. And ideally, you as the DevOps lead, you're seeing things up front in a day-to-day basis. So if your financial lead ends up catching the outlier, for example, one of our companies, like the spend jumped 100K in a month. That's a bad thing. The financial lead shouldn't catch the outlier. You should catch the outlier by putting in the right observability, monitoring tags and triggers and alerts on the spend. And so what we try and do is at least make them both aware of what the spectrum is and what the scope of responsibility is. And in the FinOps day, kind of train them up on like your best practices around monitoring your workload, monitoring your spend, having alerts, and at least get them talking to each other, because this is understanding as a financial person, understanding the cloud compute model and the cost optimization model is fairly difficult. And as a DevOps person, understanding the finance model and P&Ls is fairly difficult. So helping them communicate is part of our big learning, and helping them understand their two worlds. That's where we kind of focus on it first. Outside of that, we do a lot of course, we do incentives to get them AWS certified and to get them trained, let them go to AWS summits and re-events and talks like these that help get them up to speed. But yeah, it's a lot of, you can set best practice on training and learning and development. And what I found is it's always going to be the folks that are the most eager, they're going to be the ones that step into it and learn and apply themselves. So it's you can provide a big, robust L&D framework, and ultimately it's always going to be what's the easiest path for them. And so we try and just make a robust kind of opportunity of a bunch of different things they can do to come up to speed.
So I'm curious I'm turning the tables a bit here, but you said that you're working with some of those small to mid-sized businesses, those footprints on AWS, and with our background and what Optics does, we're working with AWS largest customers in each industry, and I think we've definitely are actively, well, we try to actively evolving what we do and how we support our customers. And so when it comes to how you dive deeper into these engagements around optimization and efficiency, what questions do you have for someone like Steph or myself of what we see and, what some hurdles that we might overcome from that aspect?
Yeah, I guess one of the challenges I see is with obviously the shift to infrastructure as code and a lot of like serverless type dynamics is tracking spend there, because that's very fluctuating, right? It's not as easy to track as like your typical monolithic workloads on EC2s and on SQL and other database servers. So what have you seen in terms of like the evolution of spend tracking, especially in serverless type environments, and how do you kind of train people up on that so that they can get better at making sure they forecast that spend fluctuation? Because this is like, it's great in theory, and then in practice you start seeing like massive run up in spend because they haven't controlled the like set kind of high watermark, low watermark usage levels around the serverless infrastructure.
Yeah, I think Steph probably has the most context here, but I would say, just to preface, is we've really learned and focused that the first step in any conversation, even if we have already worked with this customer before and we're kind of refreshing things, is to figure out what level of visibility they have and can we increase that. And that's how Cloud Intelligence dashboards were made, and how some of our tooling was made in some of Steph's great labs on Well Architected that we have, because we have to give them as much detail as possible to even start that conversation. Mm-hmm. But Steph probably has some good examples of like actual serverless conversation and what they've focused on from that standpoint.
Yeah, definitely the cost. I'm trying to put the links into the labs. Definitely the cost visibility is a massive thing. I've told the story probably a couple of times about giving a director access to every single service that they were spending in an account for every single one of their accounts. So that was like 100 services and they had like 40 accounts. I thought it was too much data, but they wanted it, so we gave it to them. Always ask what data people want. And they've noticed that their Lambda spend was rocketing up and it rocketed up massively and then just stayed super high. But because it was out of that top 10 range, because they were spending a lot more on things like RDS and EC2.
Right.
They hadn't noticed there. And that's how we kind of narrowed it down. And then they'd fallen prey to the classic like Lambda looping thing, where they had a Lambda triggering Lambda in a cycle. I also spoke to some people recently where they had, don't forget, the Lambda triggering puts a file in S3, which triggers the Lambda to pick up the file in S3, and it's just like a cycle, or the same on an SQ. And they'd kind of struggled with that and not really realized it. So I think to stop that happening, I think is awareness of infrastructure. Building with infrastructure as code can help kind of prevent that a little bit, because you're not just kind of throwing stuff randomly. It's easier to dissect where things connect in code rather than maybe jumping through the console trying to see how this one connects to this thing. Whereas in a Terraform module or in a CloudFormation stack, you can kind of break that component down. And then also making sure tags, if relevant, if you know that people are spinning stuff up and using different things, try and make sure that you tag across the board. But also use services like Compute Optimizer to check your Lambda functions. You talk about those kind of boundaries of if functions are too big. Lambda does tell you like how much I think people forget that. I know I do. When you run that metric, when you run a test on your Lambda, it tells you how much memory it used. It tells you how long it ran for, and you're paying for the memory that you provisioned rather than how much you used of it, similar to AWS volume. So don't forget to kind of go and check that. And the people that, you're right in what you were saying earlier about education, and the people that care about this will review it, because I bet people out there have got default infrastructure as code stacks that they'll reuse for everything, which is great, which is the purpose of it. But what they'll do is they'll put a default value in of that memory size and they'll never look at it. Right. And that's where a lot of money can be wasted. So recommendations, if you are building this kind of infrastructure, variabilize it and make sure that people are putting in a value that makes sense. When you're reviewing infrastructure, go and check how much you're spending. Just do like a test of the thing and see, or even choose Compute Optimizer and look at the Compute Optimizer dashboard, which is one of the ones that are available below. But yeah, good question, Jeremy. Throwing it back at us.
No, that's great insight. I like the variabilization of it. That is often forgotten. I think that in our companies, when we have the opportunity to share synergies, share some of the underlying infrastructure as code, we don't do that, and that's probably one of the misses. Is I bet you they're all using the same memory size.
Yeah, same for EC2. I bet there's default sizes of. I mean, I'm saying it because I used to do it, and I look back and I'm like, oh, Steph, what are you doing? Even like instance sizes, you would leave the default in, and that's why a lot of the time when we were looking at our infrastructure, we had loads of M4s when M5s had come out, had been out for a while, was because the default instance type was an M4, and no one had kind of. You're trying to push stuff out the door constantly, and so kind of make sure that you're reviewing this stuff as much as you would review for security compliance, review for your cost compliance, is what I like to think of.
I mean, that also plays back into the education piece that we've touched on throughout the show, right? If we can create or you can create with your customers a method for that constant education and motivation to do it, and like the reward around it, whether it's recognition or, you know, you get to talk to your coworkers about it and do a presentation, then if they're using infrastructure as code, they're influenced to keep evolving that, right? So it's all about, you know, kicking off and getting people excited, that initial education push, so that it becomes a part of the culture, which is the hardest part.
Yeah, to that end, we found our best success, and I neglected this in our last question. Our best success has actually been in building micro communities. So we have, you know, Eng lead communities, QA communities, but our most robust one is actually the DevOps lead community, for that reason, because they love to kind of one-up each other in terms of best practices and get to show off kind of what they worked on, and that becomes a revolving cycle of kind of a leapfrog approach to learning, where each of them took a challenge, mastered that, shared it, and then the next group is already better for it. So in our portfolio, that's a unique advantage, because we have, you know, 50 amazing DevOps leads that all can kind of learn from each other and learn on top of each other.
That's really cool. So that's like across your customers, you give them the opportunity to participate in that and kind of share those best practices.
Yeah. And I have a team of DevOps lead on my side that kind of help foster that community, bring it together, and then make sure that we're always kind of pushing the envelope. So
I think that's so important too, right? There's a lot of big organizations out there, amazing big organizations, but sometimes those smaller communities where people really get to talking. I know that's one of those kind of communities is why I came to AWS in the first place. It's so impactful.
Yeah.
Definitely. Okay, that we are coming to the end of time. Just last minute left. So someone asked in the chat about are companies really using the well architected framework in a structured way? I think, Jeremy, you kind of agreed that people are. If you have any follow-up questions in the chat, or if you're watching later, feel free to email us at costoptimization@amazon.com. Thanks, Jeremy, for joining us. And this will be up on YouTube if you want to watch later if you like. And next week, we have Capital One coming on to talk about enterprise cost efficiency. So again, more people from the outside of Amazon. And if you're interested in coming on, drop us an email as well. But yeah, thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you all next time.
All right. Take care.